Welcome to a follow-up video webinar which is being held, and it's really going to be a conversation between myself. I'm Professor Tania Sordin, the Dean of the University of Newcastle Law School, together with Bill Eddy. Bill, I'm hoping you can introduce yourself a bit.
Okay, I'm the co-founder and training director of Highconflict Institute. We've been around for 12 years teaching professionals about high conflict situations and high conflict personalities, how to manage them, and help people resolve their disputes. So I'm real glad to be part of this. We're based in California, the other side of the world. So between the two of us, we're covering the planet. Let me just mention my colleague, Megan Hunter, and I were teaching the class that people coming to this will have seen. And so tonight it'll be just me, but we both do a lot of work traveling around the United States, Canada, Europe, and even Australia. So we're glad to be working with Tania Sordin on this.
Thanks very much, Bill. I've had the great pleasure of working with Bill for a number of years, and a lot of the work that he does has dovetailed very neatly into some of the work that I've done on self-represented litigants, and in particular work with judges on court craft and how to deal with, I think, very difficult behaviour that you might experience in a court as well as in a mediation and in an ADR setting. And Bill actually has revealed to me that he has a new book that will come out in around middle of next year on high conflict people and mediation, which I think is really exciting. And I'm so pleased that you're actually developing a new book in that area. Tim, we might bring up the share screen of Amazon as well. So tell us a bit about the book before we start, perhaps, Bill.
Well, we've really been developing over the last 7 or 8 years methods to manage high conflict disputes in mediation. And we're finding that a lot of what people are used to doing actually blows up high conflict disputes, and people fall out of mediation. So we've really developed several paradigm shifts so that it's as much what not to do as what to do. And we engage the clients more with some simple key skills to help them be focused on dispute resolution rather than reacting and being outraged and focusing on the past. So we've really developed several paradigm shifts as you go through the mediation process. In a nutshell, what I might say is just think of what you feel like doing and do the opposite. That's what we've learned. We've learned it the hard way. But I've actually, this year, I'm celebrating doing 40 years of mediation. And I'm very excited the last 7 or 8 years that we've really been developing some really successful alternative methods. And we're looking forward to teaching people around the world who are facing high conflict disputes and mediation ways to really manage those and succeed.
Well, I might, and we thought we'd run this session as a bit of an interview style of session, where both Bill and I may have some comments, however, very, very much, I think, also hearing from Bill because of his seminal work in the area. And we might just take that screen away now, Tim, and just ensure that that we've got a good shot of Bill on the video. And I suppose the first question that I wanted to ask you, Bill, was around the different professional groups that you think are currently benefiting from high conflict training, and who maybe isn't in that picture and who isn't benefiting at the moment and could potentially benefit into the future.
Well, what's interesting is high conflict is really about conflict that gets out of control, that just keeps escalating. And we first really focused on family law professionals because family high conflict in the court system, divorces, custody, etc., we were seeing that. But then civil lawyers were really interested, and then judges were really interested. So people in dispute resolution fields have been really grasping at what can we do. But I would also say that workplace conflict resolution people, so human resources, employee assistance professionals, managers, even administrators and heads of companies are getting involved now in needing to learn these skills. But then it's graduated, if you want to use that term, to government and government agencies as well. For example, we've trained 900 Social Security disability judges in the United States because many of the cases that come seeking disability have other high conflict behaviors, and yet it's important to address which cases should get disability, which won't. Now law enforcement, they're needing to know more and more how to calm people rather than have intense confrontations. So anybody that deals with conflict, what's interesting is it goes way beyond professionals now, so that the average person is dealing with neighbor disputes, family disputes, workplace disputes, just as co-workers. And of course, we've now started dealing with government in terms of politics. So we've done training for legislative staff of legislators in one of our states, and asked by city councils, what should we do? So we're doing more and more consultation in all these areas where you would expect conflict, but you'd expect it to be resolved. And what's happening is now we're seeing these disputes that aren't getting resolved, drawing in resources, lots of other people, increasing stress for everybody. So it's hard for me to think of a profession that doesn't have some degree of this, but those are the ones that are seeing it the most so far.
It's interesting because I had a background essentially working on a court, our administrative appeals tribunal in Australia, mainly on disability support pension cases. And I think that's what really piqued my interest initially, thinking there must be a better way of managing some of these cases, because the impact of a court process on a person who has often a significant mental illness, it can be so devastating. And it really can make, I think, that mental illness far worse. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and what happened, people with mental illness are seen as difficult people. And there's a response to the difficulty as if this is a normal person being difficult. So people try for insight and they get angry at people like that. And we've learned those don't work. Insight may not work. Anger certainly won't work. And so what will help ordinary high conflict people will certainly be helpful for people with mental health problems who tend towards being high conflict themselves. So it's really, I think the same skills we're learning help with people with mental health problems or not in conflict situations.
And I might follow up with a question about that, Bill, and really about the day-to-day strategies for somebody who's in a relationship with somebody who has a whole raft of high conflict behaviours. On a day-to-day basis, how do you live with them?
Yeah, well, as we mentioned in the course, what we like to call the CARS method, which really first starts with trying to connect with the person. And we like to connect with statements that show empathy, attention, and respect. And so when someone's angry with you in your home, it's real hard to, they're so close to you in many ways, it's so easy to just react. But to the extent it's possible is to stay calm. We find that staying calm, being calm is the best way to calm somebody else. And if you're prepared, you kind of remind yourself, okay, I'm not going to join into that anger episode. Of course, taking breaks really helps in families. Sometimes going for a walk lowers the adrenaline and other chemicals, cortisol in the system. So staying calm and if possible, giving statements that show empathy, attention, and respect. You know, I can see how frustrated you are. Let's look at what we can do now. Secondly is analyzing choices. So let's look at what we can do now is a key thing to keep the focus on the future rather than going into the past, which is often high conflict situations are all about who did what when, and they shouldn't have done this and should have done that. So connect, then analyze options, respond to any misinformation. You know, you're concerned about the noise I was making yesterday. Actually, I was out of town yesterday, so that wasn't me. That might have been our neighbors. So clearing things up. And the S is setting limits. And generally, you want to set limits with empathy, attention, and respect, and say what you'll do or won't do. You can't control the other person, but you can control your response. So if you keep talking to me that way, I'm going to have to leave the conversation rather than stop talking that way. Because you can't control the other person, but you can say, okay, I'm not going to continue this. We'll have to come back when things are calmer. So connecting, analyzing options, responding to misinformation, and setting limits is really a good method in almost any setting.
And sort of taking you to another setting, and I mean, workplace conflict is an issue around the world. And if you're in a workplace conflict with somebody who does display a whole range of high conflict behaviours, are there any additional tips or strategies that you think help people in that sort of situation?
Yeah, and before I say a couple of things about that, I read something today that said 50% of workplace disputes are related to personalities and personality conflicts. So we're really on to, I think, the key area of difficulty. Now, in the workplace, often you have potential to involve other people in a positive way. There may be people who need to set limits. And for example, workplace bullying or harassment. It used to be you're supposed to talk to your supervisor if somebody's harassing you. Well, the most common scenario is it was the supervisor harassing. So being able to talk to somebody else, that there's other mechanisms in the organizations, people to talk to. There's more procedures now. In Australia, you have anti-bullying laws for the workplace. In the United States, we don't have those, although they're on the fringes and may eventually become laws. So I think it's looking at procedures. Also in the workplace, looking at the choices you have. I've consulted with people who decided to change departments so that they get away from a bad situation within the organization. So it's easier to do that than say in your family that you live with. You know, sorry kids, you know, but I'm moving out. It's really in the workplace. In many ways, you have more choices. It can also be quite stressful, though. So I'd say using the principles, using the CARS method, but also looking at what options do you have and who has leverage that you can talk to and get help from.
Yeah. It's a very difficult situation, and I think some people can really be very, very damaged by sometimes workplace conflict, which is caused by high conflict behaviours. And in a sense, that's a whole other piece around what people can do under those circumstances and where they can get some help. Can I take you to something which is also relevant, maybe slightly less relevant in the workplace, certainly in a lot of family relationships, and that relates to drug and alcohol abuse. And I'm interested to find out about how you can manage sometimes people who are affected and their behaviour is affected by drug and alcohol abuse.
Well, it's interesting because I worked in drug and alcohol treatment, inpatient and outpatient, for 6 years before I moved over to the legal side. And so I think in many ways that's easier because there's more procedures established, there's treatment established. And so It may be doing some kind of intervention, whether it's a family or an employer that says, look, you know, your behavior's now out of line, and some employers will pay for a treatment program. Some employers will say, you know, you're going to have to take time off. We hope you get treatment during that time. Many employers will allow and encourage one treatment program, because majority of people, one treatment program can make a world of difference, and they can come back and be more responsible. I think employee assistance professionals are key people involved with that, to have them help transition a person into treatment of one form or another. So there's been a lot established over the years, and in the workplace that's now, it's so procedural. It's like, what is the procedure? And responsible employers say, wait a minute, this person has a problem. We need to get them help with that problem, but it's a valued employee. It's much less expensive to get an employee with a substance abuse problem to get treatment than it is to fire them and hire a new employee, train them, look for them, all of that. So it's finding out, again, the company's procedures, the organization's approach, and implementing it.
And I suppose, you know, in terms of drug and alcohol abuse, sometimes that might be masking a high personality disorder, if you like, and that people are self-medicating and using drugs and alcohol to mask that disorder. How prevalent do you think that is in terms of a population?
It is an issue. So of the 5 high conflict personality disorders we talk about in the class, narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, antisocial, and paranoid, they all have a higher incidence of substance abuse and addiction. Antisocial personality disorder runs about 40% have a substance abuse, chemical dependency. And so it's not unusual at all. And I think you're absolutely right. It's self-medicating, that it's the person's trying to manage themselves, maybe even out their moods, etc., as well as to feel good, because they often don't feel good because their personality disorder gets in the way of successful relationship strategies. So yes, this is a common co-occurring problem with personality disorders. And what's interesting, and I saw this when I was working in alcohol and drug treatment, is people with personality disorders, when they get clean and sober, some of them get worse in their social behavior. I remember one spouse saying, you know, he was easier to deal with when he was still drinking, because when he wasn't drinking, he was so much more verbal, aggressive, etc. But there's treatment for that too. And that's the thing. Personality disorders, to some extent, there's treatment. The problem is getting people into treatment because they don't think they have a problem.
And so, Bill, we talked at the beginning about what you're working on now, and we talked a little bit about the mediation context and high conflict personalities in that context. Are you working on anything else that's interesting that viewers might like to hear about?
Well, we're also, you know, I have a book out this year. It's already out now. Why we elect narcissists and sociopaths and how we can stop. And what's interesting is at all levels of society, we're seeing high conflict personalities showing up in running for elections and being elected. I've consulted with city councils. Like I said, I've spoken to legislative staff for a state legislature. It's at all levels, and we're seeing it all around the world. It's not just in one country. And I think it's education is the answer, that people really need to see some of the warning signs and not putting these people in power. And even in the workplace, you say you have a work group and you've got a dozen people and they say, here's a new project. Who wants to be the project leader? And you may have a high conflict person says, I'll be the leader. I want to do that. I love being in charge. And everyone else goes, well, oh well, let him do it. You know, why? I don't want to bother and I don't want to fight with him, etc. So what happens is that people defer and let these folks become leaders. But then we know, for example, with narcissists as leaders, that they tend to claim credit for what other people do. They don't work that hard. They promote themselves rather than the company. And the research shows, for example, narcissists really tend to get eased out of being CEOs sooner than more bland, business-like business leaders who may seem less exciting, but they do the job. And I think of people, in, you know, in the United States, I think of Warren Buffett, Bill Gates. These are a couple people that are in many ways pretty mild-mannered, scientific, nerdy kind of leaders who happen to be some of the richest people in the world because of their business success. And so narcissists tend to kind of undermine themselves. Sociopaths, we've had companies, most recently Theranos years ago, Enron, other companies that are run by someone with sociopathic or antisocial traits. And they tend to destroy their companies. And people invest with them blindly. So I think we have a big job as educating the world in a sense, especially people in business, people in communities. Don't give these people power. They look really great, but life isn't a TV show. It's got real problems and we need people good at solving real problems.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, I think what you point out in your book is you actually talk quite a lot about the very simplistic messages that are sent as well, and how problematic those simplistic messages are. You know, this focus on the negative and the focus on a very simplistic and somewhat engaging message, and no real depth. And a lot of it is really around switching attention and really appealing to an emotional fear reaction rather than anything else, which is, I think, fascinating in terms of how we elect people and what we do for the future in the context of organisational change. Now, I wanted to take us to a couple of other points quickly before we finish today, because we're nearly at the end of our session. And I suppose one thing that I wanted to check in about was what you recommend for people who want to find out more about this topic, and what your thoughts are in relation to that.
Well, I would, of course, encourage you to come to High Conflict Institute, where we have books, video training, articles, consultation, etc. But I would also encourage people to go to law schools such as yours to learn how to manage difficult people in a legal context, because I think that in many ways lawyers are who end up dealing with these high conflict situations. Even if they're in the workplace, in the community, or in the family, they often end up with lawyers. And so lawyers today really need to be trained, have their eyes open to this, you know, side that we didn't used to worry about much in the past. That because high conflict behavior is increasing in society, so we need to increase to handle it.
Yeah, and we are delighted to have you come to Newcastle each year to run a course. The course that we run is a face-to-face intensive course, and it's one designed, I think, for lawyers and non-lawyers. And it's, I think, great in a classroom to have lawyers and non-lawyers talk about some of these issues, because I think, as you've pointed out in a couple of your books, and certainly in terms of some of your research, that oftentimes people can negotiate an outcome very successfully themselves. and that if they are unable to negotiate an outcome to an issue that they have amongst themselves, sometimes that negotiation is really fraught with difficulties because there is some high conflict behaviour present, or indeed a high conflict personality in your broader scope. And it's that piece which I think makes it very clear that what actually bubbles up into the litigation system, you're likely to have a much higher proportion of people who have high conflict personalities or behaviours in the legal system than you are in the general population. And I know that you did some work on that in relation to family dispute resolution in particular, and in the US. And you've got some views about people who end up in court in the family system. And I'm just wondering if you could share those also with our viewers.
Sure. So we developed a method called New Ways for Families, which is designed to really deal with high conflict personalities potentially. And as we mentioned in the course, high conflict personalities are when someone has a pattern of blaming others, all or nothing thinking, unmanaged emotions, extreme behaviors. But what we believe is that many of them, with the right approach, can take the edge off of their behavior. We don't necessarily change their personality, but take the edge off of their behavior so that they can reach agreements, so that they can parent their children and co-parent their children, resolve their divorces and such. So what we do is we teach 4 big skills, which happen to be the opposite of high conflict. So we teach flexible thinking, managed emotions, moderate behavior, and checking ourselves rather than blaming others. And we teach how to write emails, how to make proposals in negotiations, how to calm your emotions, all of these little skills within the big skills of these 4 big skills. So the idea is we're not just seeing the problem, we're also seeing the solutions are really around skills. Skills for people with difficult behavior, but a lot skills for professionals who are going to manage situations with difficult behavior. So that's the first one, but we have developed other new ways, which means new skills, approaches as well, if you want to hear about those.
I think I'm just conscious of the time and how much time we've got left. And I do want to check in because we've got a couple of participants who've joined in to ask some questions, and I thought they may have some matters that they want to raise with us as well. So I'll give them a minute to think about that. I do recall us having a conversation though, Bill, where I think you indicated that in your view about 50% of those involved in family court cases in certain jurisdictions really had high conflict personalities. And I was quite struck by that when I did some of my own research on the number of matters that actually track through to a final hearing before a judge. And there is evidence that it really is those matters where there are, if you like, behavioural issues that tend to now track through to a final hearing before a judge, unless it's a situation of high task complexity. So it's either high task complexity or high behavioural complexity or a combination of both. But I just want to check, I can see that we've got a couple of people online, and I'm just going to see if any of them have some questions they'd like to ask. Any questions from our audience? Jean, I can see.
Finally able to sign in.
Excellent. Jean, can you just say where you're from so that our audience knows where you're from?
I'm from Taiwan, but I live in East Coast for a long time.
Uh-huh. And do you have a question for Bill or for myself?
I kind of like his the approach for high conflict personality disorder. Try to shift something, not just as a fighting, because so many legal system, just system always put negative, and I see that is a neighbor can resolve the problem or get a conclusion. So that's why even whatever my background is not with this field, but I feel very important because so many this type of personality everywhere. And that is why, and I like to learn from Eddy because he seems to know the way to handle with this kind of people.
I can give you a brief nutshell and then steer you towards some resources. But I would say one of the big projects today, and I think Tania is as involved as we are, is in trying to get cases that are stuck in court into out-of-court methods, ADR, alternative
ADR, yes.
methods. And the reason I mentioning new ways for families is to give people skills so they can be successful in out-of-court dispute resolution. So we find that with these skills, we may be able to get close to 80% of people with high conflict behavior able to reach agreements and settle their cases out of court, out in family law cases where we've studied this. And so with skills plus alternative dispute resolution methods like mediation especially, that they're able to stay out of court. So we're hoping that that shift that you mentioned, Jean, can occur that way. One of our other new ways methods is new ways for work, which is a coaching method to teach skills to employees who may be in trouble on the edge of being moved out of their jobs, and learning skills helps with them. We're developing other new ways methods, for example, for teenagers, because we want to reach people as early as we can. So I really agree. And I would just say, in terms of resources, our website has a lot of articles that people find helpful, as well as books and videos, etc. So for professionals in training, going to law schools such as Newcastle, for individuals, our website, you can get as small a dose as you want. Just read a 2-page article, and that may even help you somewhat.
So I think we've just brought up a slide with your website on it, Bill.
There we go.
So it's there. Sorry, it took a little while to bring that up. And I think, from my perspective, the more that you read about this, I think the better. And I think it is a piece about analysing exchanges that you have, and definitely this diagnostic analytical stage. And although neither Bill or I are encouraging you to attempt a clinical diagnosis, I think it's understanding some of those warning signs and understanding when you begin to have an intuitive response and you begin to think something unusual is going on and I'm responding in the way that I might not ordinarily, you might begin to think, well, what behaviour is problematic that I'm dealing with, and then I think you pick your strategic response, which is really what I think Bill's work is so interesting in terms of having a structure to enable you to respond.
Yeah, one thing to add to that is really, it's not trying to change that person, it's how we adapt our own approach. So it's a structure, as you said, Tania, a structure for how to respond. And you don't have to diagnose anybody, and maybe someone isn't a high conflict person that you're dealing with. All the skills we teach you can use with anybody. So it's really how to manage yourself rather than how to manage other people.
Yeah. Now, I think that's probably about all the time we have. Jean, we will send you a link to the recording of this because I think you came in and out. Thank you, Homer, who sent that very nice note to say thank you very much. I know that the course was attended by well over 2,000 people, the two edX courses. We were thrilled to be collaborating with Bill at the University of Newcastle to put on that course. We do hope that people can look at some of Bill's work through the Highconflict Institute and some of his books, and we certainly invite you to consider undertaking a master's and undertaking even as a non-award student the course that Bill puts on every year. I think it's such a fascinating area, and so Bill, thank you so much for being involved in our edX project, and also thank you very much for your interview time today.
Thank you, Tania, and I really want to thank you again for the chance to do the course and to work with you. It's always great, and I think you're one of the leading thinkers in this whole big field of ADR as well. So I want to make sure you get credit for the book you've written and all the work you're doing there. So thanks for letting me be part of that, and Megan as well.
It's an absolute pleasure. And thank you, Anahita, who's just sent in a message. Anahita's a first-year law student from Manipal University in Jaipur, India, who's also sent their thanks. I think one thing that was extraordinary to us in terms of the edX was just the great diversity of people who attended the edX course, which really suggests how important a topic this is. I think we had people from more than 55 countries around the world who were interested in doing this work. And, you know, there's certainly space to talk about cultural factors as well into the future. So thank you everybody for attending today. The host will leave the meeting, and a copy of this webinar will be made available and will also be placed on our website. So thanks everybody, and thank you, Bill. Good night, Bill, in San Diego.
That's right.
Yeah,
thank
bye.
you.
Bye, bye everybody.
Have a good afternoon in Newcastle.
Will do.
All right. Okay, bye.